Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last in our series of Evolving Humanities, which had to be postponed from last spring. I'm happy to say that this has been something of a pilot program for a new program that the Center for the Humanities is doing. And I'll pause here to say that I'm Hugh Thomas. If you haven't seen me before, I'm the director for the Center for the Humanities. And we used this OLLI program to pilot something we're calling Humanities Hour, which is to feature humanities professors at the University of Miami for a more general audience. And so even though we'll be based out of the center for future events, we're really hopeful that OLLI folks will be joining us. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lindsay Thomas, who received her PhD in 2014 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has given many conference papers and invited presentations. She's published 5 articles, and she has a book forthcoming called Training for Catastrophe: National Security and the Use of Fiction After 9/11. Lindsay is also involved in a large number of digital humanities programs. And one of the exciting things that's happening in the humanities is the application of digital methods of computing in all kinds of ways, from map making to gathering masses of information. And so it's my pleasure to have Lindsay talk about some of this in her own work and in broader terms. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker for today.
Great, thanks Hugh so much. And let me just share my screen to bring the slideshow up. Okay, so you should be seeing this title slide up there. So as Dr. Thomas said, I am Lindsay Thomas. I'm an assistant professor in the English department at the University of Miami. I study sort of contemporary literature and culture and the digital humanities. The sort of intersection between literature and the digital humanities is a really big topic, and I can't cover all of it today. Today, I'm just going to really be focusing on the sort of small corner of this universe that I work within. And I also want to say that sort of despite my title is a bit of a misnomer. I'm not going to be talking too much about literature, but rather more about literary studies and about sort of directions in which humanities research is heading in its intersection with the digital humanities. So I want to just sort of briefly touch on my book, which is forthcoming, as you said, Training for Catastrophe. And I'm doing this to give you a sense of sort of how I think about literature and literary studies. The book focuses on a sort of more sociological look at literature, or as what I like to think of as literature, or thinking about what literature what it means to think about literature as a social force in the world, or on what fiction, and this book in particular focuses on what fiction means to the national security state after 9/11. So the past 20 or so years of national security. And in writing this book, I've been thinking a lot about not just fiction as an art form, although that's important for literary studies as well, but thinking more about, as I said, on what fiction does in the world and how literature operates as a social and political force. And the book itself doesn't employ quantitative methods, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, but instead makes an argument about the value of fiction. And so this question of values, of what is the value of fiction or literature today, what is the value of the humanities, is something that really drives all of my research, whether it's qualitative and more theoretical and historical like this book, or quantitative like the research I'm going to be talking about today. I think this really stems from my own personal experience, coming from a family of sort of medical professionals and healthcare workers who didn't seem to see a lot of use for the humanities or humanities research overall or generally. And sort of one of the overarching questions I've been interested in for my entire career is sort of this question of what's the use? What's the point? What's the value of studying literature or fiction today? when there are seemingly so many other things that one could be doing and ways to other than studying literature. So I just wanted to briefly touch on that because it sort of frames my interest in the digital humanities. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about what I often call computational approaches to literary studies. And what that means is sort of broadly using computers to assemble, preserve, access, and study large numbers of texts. And this sort of has two branches that I'll be focusing on today. The first branch is about making materials available online so people can more easily access them. The second branch is about using techniques in data science and text analysis and also sort of statistical or quantitative methods of analysis to study large collections of materials. And I think these sort of ways of thinking about how literature and textual analysis intersects with the digital humanities are sort of questions that quantitative analysis can help us explore in really exciting ways, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. Okay, so to help clarify what I mean by sort of a computational approach to literary studies, I think it might be helpful to point to an illustrative example of how this kind of work often gets talked about in the press and popular media more generally. So the digital humanities has made something of a sort of a splash, as much as one can make a splash in humanities research these days in recent years. And the headlines that you see on this slide here, as you can tell, are all about Shakespeare and authorship attribution, which I'll talk about in a second, are all from the past 10 years or so. These are headlines from major news outlets across the country from the past 10 years, sort of reporting on results from studies in authorship attribution and what's often called stylometrics. And so this is a way of using quantitative text analysis to determine who wrote a piece of a work of literature or a text, right? And this is done by comparing a sort of text that you have a question about, in this case, one of Shakespeare's plays, to a large body of existing texts that we know were written by Shakespeare and other authors, and then making comparisons between these two groups and seeing if the computer can help us to determine, is the text that has an unknown author more alike the Shakespeare text, or is it more like the text that we know are by other people? This kind of animating question behind this is, who wrote Shakespeare's plays? This is not a new question in early modern and Shakespeare studies, which is not my field of expertise, but I do know that scholars in this field have been discussing the role of collaboration and collaborative authorship and collaborative authorial practices in early modern theater since at least the 1980s. So this is a sort of long-standing conversation. Scholars have known for a long time that Shakespeare, didn't write all of his plays, or he engaged in sort of collaborative authorial practices that were very common in his time. What's new in these articles, however, and the ones that I'm referencing on this slide, is the use of computational analysis to determine with more precision what exactly Shakespeare might have written versus what other collaborators had written. The real thing I want to focus on, though, is the issue of why this question continues to fascinate reporters, at least, and the general public. And I think there are sort of two groups of answers to this. One is that it's about Shakespeare. So it's about a sort of well-known literary figure, someone who sort of stands for stands as sort of a genius in literature and letters, and who is still studied and taught widely today in high school and in college. So that's the first reason, I think, of why these articles continue to be written and rewritten and written over again. I think the second answer to this question is the question, who wrote Shakespeare's plays, is the type of question that is sort of attuned to an empirical quantitative work and that expects a sort of right or wrong answer, right? The answer we expect is, well, Shakespeare, we can determine with an 85% probability that Shakespeare wrote this play, or it seems, the 90% probability that somebody else might have written this play. So it's a really empirical sort of sounding question, and it's a question that can be answered with a sort of right or wrong answer. Computational methods in the humanities can give us answers to these types of questions. And I don't want to suggest that this kind of work isn't important or valuable or interesting. It is, but it's often the kind of work that gets sort of covered in the press when there is coverage of computational or digital approaches to literary studies. However, what interests me more, as I said at the top of this talk, are questions of values. And so the question I sort of am circling around today is this question of how can computational approaches help scholars and students and people outside of the academy to answer questions about meaning and value. And these types of questions are really at the heart of what I do as a literary scholar. What a lot of literary scholars do is thinking about what a particular work of literature or a body of literary texts mean and why we should value them and what they tell us about ourselves. And so that's what I want to be thinking through today, is how can computational approaches help us to answer this type of perhaps more traditionally humanistic question rather than a sort of more empirical question. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on answering this type of question by focusing on one of the digital humanities projects that I've been involved with for quite some time, since around 2012, actually, when I was still a graduate student at UC Santa Barbara. And this is the What Everyone Says project. This project takes the question about the value of the humanities as its research topic. So it focuses on studying contemporary public discourse around about the humanities, or in other words, sort of what the news and journalists more broadly have to say about the value of the humanities today. I've been working on this project in some shape or form, as I said, since 2012. And the past 3 years, I've been working on this project under the sort of auspices of a grant that we received from the Mellon Foundation in 2017. And so we're wrapping up the 3 years of funding that we received from this foundation, the $1.1 million grant that we received. We're wrapping up that period of funding this year. Our project focuses, as I said, on how the humanities are discussed in the news and contemporary news media, including newspapers, television and radio news transcripts, and also on social media. So we have data from Twitter and from Reddit, two social media networks. Our project is multi-institutional. We're based at 3 different universities. So we're based at UM, we're based at UC Santa Barbara, and then at California State University in Northridge, which is the Cal State system campus in LA. Our project involves 4 faculty principal investigators, so 4 sort of collaborators on this project, 2 postdoctoral researchers, and this year we had about 30